Ave Regina Celorum, Ave Domina Angelorum, Salve Radix, Salve Porta, ex famundo lux extorta, Gaude Virgo gloriosa, super omnes.
Yesterday we had James L. Buckley introducing, and today we have James F.W. Buckley introducing. Jay is a member of the class of 1973. He is the father of 3 Portsmouthians. And
2 graduates, 1 current student.
Right. And he and Sheila are also presidents of our Parents Association and members of the Board of Regents. Jay Buckley.
Thank you, Jamie. Before I begin, I just need to do one thing. Cousin Christopher, wherever you are, I forgive you. My first experience with the Catholic William F. Buckley came from a story that circulated through the family in my youth. Uncle Bill would take young Christopher to Mass every week, and almost always they arrived a few minutes late after Mass had begun. One week they arrived early. They sat for a little while waiting for the priest to begin, and Christo, in that child's whisper that can be heard across the infield at the Indianapolis 500, said to his father, "Pop, God is late." As has been mentioned, Uncle Bill didn't talk much about his Catholicism. He lived it. Therefore, my most prolonged exposure came from reading his book, Nearer My God, referenced by many who have spoken before me. I brought my copy and would just like to read to you the inscription to J. Buckley, my favorite nephew, William F. Buckley, Jr. So proud was I that I rushed to my sister to show her my treasure. "Idiot," she said. "He calls all 50 nieces and nephews favorite." In the book, he writes movingly about the ordination of my cousin, Michael Bozell, as a priest in the Benedictine monastery of St. Peter in Solesmes, France. You may have noticed the picture of Uncle Bill with Michael downstairs in the display in the foyer. We had hoped to bring Michael here as part of this celebration to share with you his special faith-based relationship with Uncle Bill. However, our abbot didn't appear to have enough influence over his abbot to spring him for the weekend. So therefore, Jamie McGuire asked that I contact Michael to see if there were any thoughts he would like to share with you. Herewith what he sent. So this is from Michael. "I entered the Benedictine Abbey of Solesmes in France in 1978, in part, perhaps, to do penance for the sins of the Carter administration. Mine was the first, and as far as I know only, religious vocation in the Buckley family, and my Uncle Bill showed epistolary support from the beginning, but that support was always couched in a subtle manner which I understood as his discreet way of communicating to me that I must never feel obligated to an admiring family to continue on the path I'd begun to explore should it prove unsuitable. But it was far from unsuitable, and Bill's encouragements and obvious joy expressed themselves in lots of ways. Sometime in the early 1980s, he decided that a contemplative monk could not possibly be faithful to his otherworldly enterprise without a laptop computer. The only problem was the logistics in getting it to this forlorn Departement de la Sarthe, hidden away somewhere between Le Mans and Angers in France. His old Toshiba was finally delivered by the U.S. ambassador to France. It was about this time that my adopted community, having seen neither a U.S. ambassador nor a computer for that matter, began to emit signals that it was wondering whether taking on this particular American novice had been such a good idea after all. Eventually, Bill took to making lightning visits to Salem, always inquisitive, ever ready to raise questions touching on the faith. Once carrying the Herald Tribune in what was a very clenched fist, he demanded to know what the church had to say about a God who allows random earthquakes to bury thousands of innocent victims. In these exchanges, it was always clear that Bill's faith and submission to the church's teaching were perhaps unquestionable, but they were not necessarily unquestioned. I wasn't too surprised when reading Christopher's recent memoir this spring that Bill had explored the issue of suicide. Given the tortured circumstances of his final months, it is hard to imagine him having done otherwise. But underneath the drive to forge a reasoned response to some of the great moral dilemmas life throws at us, I sense that in Bill, unfailingly, something more than the respectful attention to what the church, I sense that in Bill unfailing something more than respectful attention to what the church teaches. Though in his mind, though his mind might be far from being satisfied by clerical elucidations, he retained an ingrained deference, a habit of yielding inwardly when he was told that, on such and such a position, the church was unwavering. What Bill had received as a child in the way of religious education clearly left an indelible imprint on his character. I have sometimes mused that his childlike devotion to God was the great effective springboard underlying his legendary friendliness towards others. And in the same way, his fundamental willingness to bend, ultimately, to the church's moral authority seems to have contributed to the intellectual assurance that freed him to pursue truth with such magnificent gusto. Thank you, Michael. It is now my honor to introduce somebody who I found out yesterday was an attendee at Michael's ordination in France. Dr. Lee Edwards is the Distinguished Fellow in Conservative Thought at the Heritage Foundation's B. Kenneth Simon Center for American Studies. His heritage biography tells us that he is widely regarded as the chief historian of the American conservative movement, having published more than 15 books about the leading individuals and institutions of American conservatism, including biographies of Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater, and a history of the Heritage Foundation. Of Uncle Bill, he told me that, quotes, he changed my life by publishing my first piece of nonfiction in National Review some 50 years ago, at a time when I was trying to be a novelist. He was right, I was wrong. Dr. Edwards will be publishing a short biography of Uncle Bill this fall. I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Lee Edwards to the Portsmouth Institute.
Thank you, Jay. And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a beautiful day in Portsmouth and a great day to be alive. I feel, coming to bat as I am, a little bit as though I'm coming after Babe Ruth, Mickey Mantle, and Alex Rodriguez, all of whom have hit home runs. So what am I going to offer you all? But fortunately, Bill Buckley is a never-ending feast. I can think of all the many dissertations which are going to be written, probably already being written right now, about him, such as the misogyny of Blackford Oaks, William F. B., the libertarian, William F. B., the traditional conservative, Buckley and the essential relationship between the harpsichord and 12-meter sailing. I really don't know what the heck 12-meter sailing is. I probably misused it. So will that dissertation writer. Bill Buckley was the master, wasn't he, and of the one-liner. And we've heard several of them already this weekend. And he could sum up any issue or put down anyone with just a few well-chosen words. Here are two of my favorites. After the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown in the 1980s, he wrote, "The Soviet Union has finally contrived to give power to the people." He once suggested an advertising campaign for the New York Times. Beneath a smiling Fidel Castro would appear the words, "I got my job through the New York Times." But there was one subject which Bill took very seriously and about which he brooked no joking, and that was his Roman Catholic faith. He raised the Crusader standard in his very first work, God and Man at Yale, published nearly 60 years ago, in which he declared, quote, that the duel between Christianity and atheism is the most important in the world. And for the rest of his life, he dueled against the atheists and their assorted fellow travelers. When a Playboy magazine interviewer asked whether most dogmas, theological as well as ideological, do not crumble sooner or later, Bill replied firmly, most, but not all. When the interviewer pressed Buckley, how could you be so sure? Back came the ringing words, I know that my Redeemer liveth. As he once explained, I'm not tortured by the problems that torture a great many other people, because I do very sincerely and very simply believe in God and the whole of the Christian experience. Where and how did he get such certainty, such faith? And we've heard references. And of course it comes from his father, who took his faith very seriously, attending Sunday Mass, saying his evening prayers on his knees. That's a picture which Bill talks about, seeing his father kneeling and saying his prayers. During the Mexican Revolution of the early 20th century, as Roger said yesterday, Will Sr. joined an underground that hid priests whose lives were threatened and concealed religious artifacts that might have been seized by rebel armies. Well, Buckley Sr. was also a laissez-faire capitalist and passionate anti-communist. He regarded communism as the Antichrist. And Bill learned to fight for what he believed to be important, his church, his country, and his family, from his father and from his mother, Eloise Steiner, the beautiful daughter of a successful New Orleans banker. She was a college graduate whose poems were published in the New Orleans Times-Picayune. But she married Will Buckley in 1917, spent the rest of her life happily raising her family of 10 children and charming a wide circle of friends. Her son, Senator Jim, who is with us this weekend, says that hers was the dominant influence when it came to such essentials as faith. Eloise Buckley prayed for everything, even good weather, saying nothing was too unimportant for God. Bill learned to say the rosary from his mother, and I learned in my interview with him some 10 years ago that he said it every day for the rest of his life. And he was buried with his rosary and a jar of his favorite peanut butter. Well, in the Buckley household, Lent was scrupulously observed. The keyboard of the piano was locked on Good Friday, and the children collected in their mother's room to talk about and reflect upon the Passion of our Lord. For all the Buckleys, the church was at the center of their lives. And I love this story. When Bill and his sister Patricia, or Trish as we know her, perhaps aged 8, overheard their mother and father saying the two family friends, sisters, were fated to go to hell because they had not been baptized, the two young Buckleys determined to act. The next time the two women visited Great Elm, Bill and Trish waited until they were taking an afternoon nap and then sneaked into their room and baptized them with holy water. For some time thereafter, whenever non-Catholic guests stayed overnight at Great Elm, Bill and Trish would get up in the middle of the night, silently baptize their visitors, until their mother discovered what they were doing and ordered them to stop. But not before they had saved several souls. In Trish's words, the Buckleys were rollicking Catholic mavericks in the middle of a predominantly Protestant community. Encouraged by their father to be independent and opinionated, and that they certainly all were, all the children, but particularly Bill, came to regard themselves as counter-revolutionaries against the zeitgeist of America, which at that time was Protestant and New Deal Democratic. Inspired by his mother, Bill came to have this extraordinary personal relationship with God. When the family toured Europe, for example, young Bill often went off to pray in a church rather than tour a museum, and he frequently served at Mass as an altar boy. When he was 16, he wrote his mother, "Probably the greatest contribution you have given me is your faith. I can now rely on God in almost any matter." Undoubtedly, he was remembering a few years earlier when he was sent to England to be enrolled at St. John's, Beaumont, the Catholic version of an English public school. Run by the Jesuits, St. John's was the first place where Bill encountered intellectually rigorous Catholicism. "One begins to sense," he said later, "that there are depths in a position that one tended to accept rather two-dimensionally." While at St. John's, he learned that his mother's life was threatened by her current pregnancy, and he deliberately knelt throughout Mass every morning, and the kneelers at St. John's had no soft paddings, just like the kneelers here at Portsmouth I learned this morning. And Bill asked God to spare his mother and the baby. His prayers and penance were answered, and his belief in God was deepened. So when he entered Yale in September 1946, after being discharged from the Army, 20-year-old Bill Buckley was ready by reason of his father's unstinting preparation and his own extraordinary ability to take on the world. And he went on to change the world. And he certainly changed my life. As Jay has said, he published my first article in National Review when all of my increasingly desperate efforts to write fiction, novels, short stories, poems, this is all I was over in Paris at the time, were being rejected. I stuck with nonfiction from then on. Remember so well that in those early days, the late 50s, early 60s, we young conservatives had this awe and, yes, love for Bill. So what did we do? Well, we tried to emulate it. We raised our eyebrows. We draw. We searched our thesaurus for the rare and the obscure. We strove to be outrageous, murmuring all the while, l'audace, toujours l'audace. He had a special affinity for young people, as has been remarked by Catherine and others. And my wife, Anne, can attest to this. About 1960, this is before we knew each other, Anne and I, she was living in New York City, working, and she had gone to join the Young Women's Republican Club of New York. And she was the editor of the newsletter at a very, about 19 or 20. And she wrote this editorial, which was critical of Governor Rockefeller, a liberal, and praiseworthy of Barry Goldwater. Well, this caught the eye of a certain editor of a certain magazine. The telephone rang in Anne's apartment, and she picked it up, and the voice said, "Miss Stevens, yes, this is Bill Buckley. We would like to invite you to attend the editorial board meeting of the National Review." And to which Anne said, "Oh, Bob, stop playing games as you always do," and hung up. The Bob was Bob Shookman, who was a friend of ours at the time, but later on became head of Young Americans for Freedom, a brilliant young conservative, died tragically much too young. So she went back to whatever she was doing, reading or something like that. Phone rang again. Picked it up. "Miss Stevens, yes, this really is Bill Buckley, and we really would like to have you come to our editorial board meeting of the National Review." Oh, yes. And it's next week, and the date, whatever it was. And Anne Stevens, who, not even a college graduate, but an instinctive conservative, found herself seated around an editorial table with James Burnham and Bill Rusher and Frank Meyer and so forth, and going around, and that they were talking about various topics, at the end of which, for example, I was talking about Katanga, Moise Shambe, and Bill turns, and Miss Stevens, what do you think about that particular topic? And of course, he said, oh, no, what am I going to say? But the point is that he was reaching out to young people, trying to encourage them, trying to lift them up and to include them and to build for the future. Certainly, I think that E.J. Dionne got it absolutely right last night. One of the few times he got it right. E.J., you're not okay. Just kidding, just kidding. Bill Buckley did more than any other conservative to shape the modern conservative movement. Consider this: born during the middle years of President Calvin Coolidge, wrote his first book while Harry Truman was in the White House, founded National Review during the modern Republican years of Dwight D. Eisenhower, launched his newspaper column when John F. Kennedy was eyeball to eyeball with Nikita Khrushchev, ran for mayor of New York City just after Lyndon B. Johnson had whipped Barry Goldwater for the presidency, criticized Richard Nixon for going to China, and Jimmy Carter for not staying in Georgia, reached his political apogee during the golden years of Ronald Reagan, made excuses for George H.W. Bush, a fellow Yalie, warned conservatives not to neglect hard issues like school choice and Social Security in favor of a lascivious focus on President Clinton's personal misbehavior, and vacillated widely between strong support and equally strong disapproval of President George W. Bush's Iraq war policy. Undergirding all of his positions was his essentially orthodox Catholicism. He was never, in Michael Novak's phrase, a flying buttress Catholic who rarely went to church, but a deeply believing Catholic who, as Catherine Lopez said earlier, had a very early love affair with Christ. Wow. In a 1983 lecture at Mount St. Mary's, he examined Christ's statement that his kingdom was not of this world. Well, as a child, he said, he interpreted this to mean that Christ had a different address from his, and perhaps could only be reached by airmail. As a young man, he interpreted it as an injunction to care about Christ-like things, rather than about things of this world. But in due course, he said, I smelled Manichaeism in this, which a natural hedonism helped me to overcome. As an older man, he understood Christ to have told us that although his kingdom was not of this world, it is a kingdom he will one day share, leaving it to us, inhabiting our own city, to be counseled by the lessons that Christ taught us, and to be inspired by the example he set of his love for us by coming to us. And of course, there's that famous wisecrack. Because of this famous wisecrack at National Review some 40 years ago now, Mater si magistra no, and his early qualified opposition to Humanae Vitae, he said, quote, at the time, it's not an obvious violation of the marital ideal to permit contraception. Bill was sometimes, and maybe more than sometimes, cited by liberal Catholics as one of them. But consider these sturdily traditional positions by Bill on matters of faith and morals. Original sin, quote, I just know no explanation for what it is that we face every day in our lives that is so illuminating as is the concept of original sin. The glory of Christianity is that it enables us to overcome original sin. Heaven and hell. Quote, I grant the probability that hell is not a place in which the devil is required to maintain a Fahrenheit temperature of 220 degrees, or that heaven is not a place of pink clouds and those fat little winged cherubs. But I don't doubt that there are two conditions two posthumous conditions. One of them a condition of desolation, and the other a condition of joy. Papal infallibility. I do believe in the infallibility of the Pope. I believe in it as an act of faith. But unless the Pope makes it unmistakably clear, as was done, for instance, in the question of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that this is intended to be infallibly true, it is prudent to suppose that an infallible pronouncement was not intended. The role of Mary in Catholic life. Mary, it seems to me, he said, he wrote, is all of those things that the litany says about her. She's not divine, but a veneration of Mary as the exemplary woman, it seems to me, cannot conceivably be thought of as in any way profane. Creation. Creation. Quote, the order of the universe, the arching of the human spirit, the enduring mysteries of love, and the unique serenity and faith are the result of central planning, which took 7 days to create a world exciting enough to doubt him. You could spend a long, long time thinking about those words. Now, National Review was not a Catholic magazine, but it was certainly run by Catholics. Besides Bill, there were, over the years, his brother-in-law, L. Brent Bozell, who, by the way, was my godfather, so I had that connection also. His sister, Priscilla, James P. McFadden, Frank Meyer, who, as we heard yesterday, was converted on his deathbed, James Burnham, another convert, Jeffrey Hart, Joseph Sobran, Ed Capano, Cato Byrne, Catherine Lopez, John O'Sullivan, who succeeded Bill as editor of National Review. And there were many, many Catholic contributors to National Review. Russell Kirk, Eric von Kuhnhoff-Ledeen, Patrick J. Buchanan, Claire Booth Luce. But for all of his orthodoxy, Bill never hesitated to criticize the church's politics, particularly when it was not, in his eyes, sufficiently anti-communist. Now, here is the, I think, a slightly more complete story of NR's criticism of that famous encyclical Mater et Magistra. It was issued in July of 1961, shortly after Fidel Castro publicly acknowledged that he was a communist, and 1 month before the Berlin Wall went up. National Review at that time commented that the document, the encyclical, Mater et Magistra, which focused on the problems of developing countries and called for an end to Western colonialism, quote, must strike many as a venture in triviality, coming at this particular time in history. In the next issue, the magazine published the famous wisecrack, going the rounds in Catholic conservative circles, Mater si, Magistra no. The remark, given Bill by fellow Catholic Gary Wills, was a play on the Castro slogan, Cuba si, Yankee no. This is where the story really gets very, very interesting. Led by the Jesuit magazine America, liberal Catholics counterattacked, accusing Buckley and his magazine of everything but burning the Pope at the stake. America accused National Review of disloyalty to the Church and stated that it owed its Catholic readers and journalistic allies an apologies. Now think of it, a Jesuit magazine fiercely defending the Pope and the Church. Well, Bill politely responded in a public letter that National Review was no more a Catholic magazine because its editor is a Catholic than the Kennedy administration is a Catholic administration because its head is a Catholic. So as usual, Bill had the last word. He urged America to reconsider its anathema and to join forces with National Review against the true common enemy, communism. Bill continued to oppose John 23rd, Paul VI attempts to promote détente, but he rejoiced. There was a question about this, I think, earlier today, or perhaps yesterday, about John Paul II. He rejoiced when John Paul II, among many actions, joined with President Reagan in a dazingly effective campaign during the 1980s to support Solidarity, that trade union, which undercut the communist regime in Poland and later helped to undermine and bring down communism in Eastern and Central Europe. And then there's the issue of contraception and the Church's position as set forth in Humani Vitae. Bill Buckley opposed the encyclical, although, according to Gary Wills, he was bothered at the prospect of public dispute. I want to spend just a few minutes discussing the issue, following up on Catherine's remarks, because it's offered so often as proof that Bill Buckley was somehow a less than faithful Catholic. Following the publication of Humani Vitae, Bill stated that the anti-contraception dogma grew out of an anti-Manichaean argument that fleshly pursuits were unhealthy. 2 decades later, he told me that the church had to decide between contraception and abortion, because if it continued to insist that contraception violates the moral law, it would weaken its proper and needed moral arguments against abortion. At the same time, National Review strongly condemned the Supreme Court's 1973 decision in Roe versus Wade. And Bill himself remained resolutely pro-life. He argued, for example, that the plank in the 1996 Republican Party platform should reaffirm that life should be protected, and that the position of voters in individual states, rather than that of the courts, should prevail on the question of abortion. Bill also justified his contraception position by arguing that Humani Vitae was not declared ex cathedra and was therefore not an infallible doctrine. He quoted approvingly Catholic convert Claire Booth Luce, who said that the difference between abortion, the Hiroshima bomb of birth control, and a contraceptive has got to evoke some sense of moral distinction. In 1994, when John Paul II led the battle against birth control at the UN conference in Cairo, Bill immediately challenged the Pope by suggesting that contraception and abortion were equally sinful. Bill argued the Holy Father had edged the Vatican out of the picture as an important player in the continuing dialogue about overpopulation, which had been an issue of some concern to him. Later that same year, I asked Bill if he had read the theologian Janet Smith's seminal work, Humani Vitae, a generation later, or was familiar with her case against contraception and for natural family planning. He admitted he had not. I promised to send him a copy. In Nearer My God, Bill's only book about the faith, he quotes Janet Smith, quote, that the procreative good of sexual intercourse ought to be protected. He also qualifies his later opposition to Paul VI's encyclical, writing, quote, my own incomplete understanding of the natural law balks at the central affirmation of Humani Vitae, even as I'd of course counsel dutiful compliance with it. He does not include in Nearer My God the finding of the noted Catholic historian John T. Noonan, whose work Bill admired openly, that from St. Jerome and St. Augustine through St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Charles Borromeo up to Vatican II, quote, no Catholic theologian has ever taught that contraception is a good act. Nearer My God, it's a wonderful book in many, many ways, especially in 2 chapters. In 1994, it has been mentioned by several of the speakers, Bill traveled to Lourdes, not to seek a miraculous cure of a physical ailment. He was in comparatively good health at the time, but to satisfy his curiosity about what exactly goes on there and what its impact might be on one first-time visitor. He left Lourdes deeply, profoundly touched by the faith of thousands of Malads who came hoping but not expecting a miracle, who came away, quote, with a sense of reconciliation, if not well-being. Our burden, he writes, is to keep the faith, whatever God's plan for us, knowing that the greatest tonic of all is divine love, which is nourished by human love, even as human love is nourished by divine love. St. Augustine would like that for its insight into God's plan and for its parallel structure. The most personal chapter of Near Our God describes the ordination of Michael Bozell, which Jay has referred to. This chapter is primo Buckley. It's just wonderful. Please, if you haven't, read it. It's filled with these evocative sketches of the 51 relatives and friends who traveled to the famous Benedictine Abbey of Salem in northern France for Brother Michael's ordination. The truly awful wine at the party the night before. Alas, there was no miracle. A moving letter from Brother Brent in his wheelchair to son Michael, and a description of the monastery with, quote, its unmistakable feel and aroma of age and piety and indomitability. Lying in his snug hotel bed and thinking of the young monk in his cell rising at midnight to sing, Bill reflected that almost certainly Michael was the happiest of us all, and that only God can dispense such a thing as that. A frequently visited topic on his public affairs TV program, Firing Line, was the place of religion in the modern world. Asked why Whittaker Chambers had written that the Christian church represented the only truly conservative force in the world, Clare Booth Luce replied that the church had preserved for 2,000 years a true view of the nature of man, a creature who is capable of being a saint and who is most of the time a sinner. When former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was asked what were the prospects for the survival of the West, the elder statesman, who was 86, replied that he couldn't understand why so many people who believe so firmly in the brotherhood of man have so much difficulty believing in the fatherhood of God. The British historian Paul Johnson related the question of survival to the political consequences of idealism and atheism, saying that in his book, Modern Times, he pointed out that when you drive towards a utopian state, there's no point of balance. There's no stasis there. You have to drive onwards, or else you go backward and relapse into capitalism. You have to drive onward until you create boat people and put men like Vladimir Bukovsky in psychiatric prisons. In their conversation broadcast at Christmas time, the author-journalist Malcolm Muggeridge and Bill agreed that Christendom was coming to an end, probably was finished, but there's good news, Muggeridge insisted, and quoted St. Augustine on the sacking of Carthage by the barbarians. This is grievous news, Augustine wrote, but let us remember, if it's happened, then God has willed it, and that men build cities and men destroy cities, that there's also the city of God, and that's where we belong. To me, Muggeridge said, that's the perfect expression, and added, it's only insofar as we are citizens of the city of God that we can be Christians in the city of man. That we can bear it, Bill responded. That we can bear it, Muggeridge agreed. Such faith resonated with Bill, who as a schoolboy in England began all of his essays with the initials AMDG, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam. When I once asked Bill if he thought he would go to heaven, he flashed that wonderful, famous smile and drawled, I want very much to. He added as much for himself as for every pilgrim, anybody who is searching for God will find him. And by the grace of God, Bill found him at a very early age and assiduously practiced the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity throughout his life. He was a dutiful son of the church who served as a lector for 3 years at St. Mary's Church in Stamford, before finally concluding that he was distracting the faithful with meaningless and utterly uncommunicative objurgations. Bill was a believer in God's salvific love. After visiting St. Bernadette's birthplace in France, he wrote that as many as 50,000 people, the great majority of them healthy, visit Lourdes every day, not to be cured of a physical malady, but to seek reconciliation with God. He was a free spirit who believed in the Holy Spirit, a libertarian who loved Our Lady, a novelist whose love scenes would have received a nihil obstat if requested. His acts of charity rendered to family and friends were legion. He once visited a young man in a Texas hospital who was recovering from wounds incurred in Vietnam. His doctors had told him he would never see again. Bill secured his flight to New York City, where after an examination by one of the world's leading eye surgeons and 3 operations, the young veteran's eyesight was restored. Learning that a friend had written several Christmas songs for children, Bill had them orchestrated and presented in concert to an enchanted audience of children. Casting about for an appropriate gift for his longtime secretary, Gertrude Voigt, when she retired to hilly San Francisco, Bill arranged with the Yellow Cab Company to give her a permanent free ride on any of his cabs. In June 2007, I invited him to Washington, D.C. to receive an award, the Truman Reagan Medal of Freedom. I didn't know just how ill he was and how difficult it was for him to travel. But he took the long train ride from Stanford because a friend asked him. And that night, I know that with old friends like Jack Kemp and Joe Lieberman and others, he was the William F. Buckley of old. He talked about the lives of others, the best film he had seen in years and maybe ever, with its story of a Stasi agent in East Germany who turns anti-communist. Bill Buckley could have been the playboy of the Western world, but chose to be the St. Paul of modern American conservatism. For all of his talents and honors, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President George H.W. Bush. He had humility. He loved to recount when he invited Marc Chagall, one of France's greatest artists, to inspect one of his paintings, of which he was particularly proud. So Chagall looked at Buckley's painting, slapped his cheek and said, "Oh, the poor paint." Let me bring up here, if I may, the story that at the very last Bill Buckley was considering suicide. That's already been referred to. And there's certainly no question in his final years, particularly year, he was suffering terribly from a host of serious ailments, diabetes, high blood pressure, emphysema. And he talked frequently and yearningly to friends and colleagues, particularly after Pat's death, about his own death. In losing Mum and Pup, Christopher recounts his telephone conversation with the biographer Sam Tannenhouse, who reported that in early 2008, Bill had told him that he was contemplating suicide. He, Bill, had discussed it with 2 priests who told him that while it would be a sin, it would be a forgivable sin. Well, I thought Christopher might respond that they must have been Jesuits. But instead he went to the heart of the matter. Well, he didn't commit suicide, he told Salmon House. He died of a heart attack. Bill Buckley was neither the first nor the last Catholic to think about and even talk about suicide, but as Father Michael said, he knew, whatever those 2 priests may have said, that such an act was a serious mortal sin, and he would abide by what the church told. Bill Buckley was fiercely loyal to the institutions that nurtured him all of his life: church, family, country. He was, in his own words, obedient to God and to the wisdom of my ancestors, never to the authority of political truths arrived at yesterday at the voting booth. He wasn't sanguine, particularly sanguine about the moral state of America. He referred to the quiet triumph of secularism in the past 30 years. asserted that the evangelists of agnosticism no longer feel the need to move their armies against what, in their judgment, is nowadays only a derelict defense force. Nevertheless, he was ever ready for battle. He declared with Chesterton that the men signed of the cross of Christ go daily and gaily into the dark. He was, as Father Richard Newhouse put it, a Catholic with all flags unfurled, pursuing his vocation. He summed up his faith and his life with 6 words: I know that my Redeemer liveth. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Mr. Edwards for that wonderful talk. The title of your speech is The William F. Buckley I Knew, and for those of us who did not know Mr. Buckley, although who have been influenced by him, it's a wonderful way to sort of bring this all back home, and you really get a sense of the man that I didn't know, and I feel like I do now, so thank you very much. Secondarily, I'm also excited to know that my mother is also from New Orleans, and my mother also taught me the rosary, so I'm excited about that. If there are any questions, can we please open them up? In the back here.
You can't imagine how relieved I am to have that behind me.
Dr. Edwards, you talk about the disagreements between Buckley and his esteemed cousin, L. Brent Bozell, brother-in-law, and what that was about.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, as I said, Bill Buckley changed my life, and in a very real sense, so did Brent Bozell, but he was my godfather. And I have to tell the story. Those of you who know Brent Bozell will certainly appreciate this. So it was on a Saturday, and I was all set to be received at the church and baptized, and I'd asked Brent to be my godfather. So we were supposed to meet at St. Patrick's in downtown DC at 11 o'clock. Guess what? 11 o'clock. No godfather. 11:05, 11:10, the priest is looking at me, I'm looking at the priest. I'm thinking, is this a sign? No. And finally, at 11:22, Brent comes running up this, out of breath. Oh, I'm so sorry, I had other things to do and so forth. And so it came off okay. Brent was a traditional Catholic and became increasingly more traditional, became more and more in love with the idea of the Spanish style of Catholicism, founded a magazine called Triumph, and took, one might say, an inflexible position on most matters of faith and morals. Bill Buckley was not editing a Catholic magazine. Triumph was a Catholic magazine, edited by laymen for laymen. Bill Buckley was editing a general interest magazine, which certainly was influenced, as we've heard from myself and others as well, by his faith. But he would take positions which were at variance for one reason or another, if he felt that they should be, particularly on political matters. And so these two men, who were very, very close, who were roommates and were so close by reasons of education and marriage and politics, became, unfortunately, separated. But at the same time, they did become reconciled at the end, particularly at that ordination of Brother Michael, Father Michael, when they were there. And I think that's probably the way to end that story. Please,
Could you talk a little bit about the beginning of Young Americans for Freedom, and were you the editor of the New Guide? I go back to the beginning, or almost the very beginning of that, so it's fun for me to see you again, and see
Well, Bill Buckley is my little biography, which will be published by ISI Books sometime this fall. It's a very short little biography. I make the case that he was the maker of the conservative movement. And so the founding of National Review was a political act intended to help create a movement. Another important political act by Bill Buckley was to help found and to inspire the founding of Young Americans for Freedom in 1960. That was 5 years after the founding of National Review. We had our founding conference there at Great Elm in Sharon, Connecticut. He was not, front and center stage, but he's very much the presence which we were already very much aware of and in awe of, as I say, trying to emulate. He continued to do that, to bring about whatever he thought would help to advance the conservative movement. That included getting rid of the kooks like the John Birch Society, the philosophically extremists like the Randians, Ayn Rand, and also early on making it clear that the conservative movement was not an anti-Semitic movement. And this was very early on in the 1950s, making sure that anyone who wrote for the American Mercury, which had become an anti-Semitic magazine, could not also write for National Review. Helped to found the Conservative Party of New York, and on and on and on. One influence, this is relative to our topic of the weekend, there was a big debate about what was called the Sharon Statement, which is our statement of principles. It's very short, just a page long. But there was a big debate between, there were about 85 or 90 of us there, talking about many things, including this particular statement. And it came down to a quite intense debate over whether or not the phrase God-given rights should be included. And there was a division between the traditionalist conservatives, like myself, and the libertarians as to whether that should be there. Traditionalists, it should be. Libertarians, should not be. We took a vote. The vote was 44 for inclusion, 40 for exclusion. So it was a close vote, 44 to 40, but it did prevail. God-given rights is in that, and I think that is probably because that there we were, in Bill Buckley's front yard, and we couldn't very well deny God under those circumstances. Yes, sir.
First, Mr. Edwards, I'd like to thank you for all you do with the Heritage Foundation. It's really the beacon of the national conservative movement, and it continues Mr. Buckley's work very well. My question is, Mr. Buckley really, helped to spur the Reagan Revolution and the kind of fusionistic conservatism. Now, considering we're alone in the wilderness and it was an off year last year, do you think there needs to be a kind of a new type of revolution, sort of a neo-fusionism, or do you think there needs to be a kind of a new type of conservatism altogether? Because right now, candidates aren't looking, they're looking pretty sparse, and just leaders in general, other than the Heritage Foundation and organizations like it, in general, it doesn't look like it's garnering new members. So what would you suggest?
Well, I would begin by saying that as a conservative, new is not one of my favorite words. A longer answer, which I won't give you all this morning, is to go to the website of the Heritage Foundation, and you will see there a rather long essay by me called "The End of Conservatism?" in which I talk precisely about this. So not too long, but it's not a short essay, but it's not too long. I think it's a pretty good one. Basically, and Neil Freeman and I were talking about this at breakfast, There are 5 essential elements. I'm going to get very professorial here, excuse me. 5 essential elements of of any political movement. A philosophy must be consistent, coherent, relevant. There must be a national infrastructure, a national constituency. There must be sound financing, an adequate financial base. There has to be media proficiency, particularly, we're driven by the mass media these days, really by the internet now. And the most, perhaps the most important of all, I think philosophy is first, but certainly as almost as important, is charismatic, principled leadership. 2 words, charismatic and principled. And I make the case in this essay, philosophy still solid. I mean, you can't say conservatism is old-fashioned. That's like saying the 10 Commandments or the Constitution are old-fashioned and out of date. Nonsense. National infrastructure. The Tea Parties prove that there still is a national infrastructure. Financing, we're in pretty good shape there. With regard to media proficiency, thanks to Catherine, we're doing better and better in the internet. Charismatic principal leadership, yes, there is a gap there. There is a vacuum there. But there are promising young conservatives coming up, at least young from my perspective, and in the Congress and the House, the Senate, governors, and so forth. So I think one of them is going to emerge at some point. Now, it may not be as quickly as you and I would want, but because we're strong in those first 4 areas, that 5th area is going to be served before too much longer, so be patient. Yes, sir.
Did Bill Buckley ever discuss with you the Catholic understanding or doctrine of grace or sanctifying grace? Because there are those who think that coming out of the Second Vatican Council, this was one of the great de-emphasis and consequent, and therefore someone who struggles with the natural law with reference to Humanae Vitae. I think there was an understanding in that encyclical that what was being asked of married couples was virtually impossible without God's grace.
I don't think I asked him that question. I had an extensive interview with him in late '94, and that's the basis for a lot of my commentary this morning. I didn't ask him that particular question, so I'm sorry. I can't respond to it. But I'm confident that he certainly believed in it, understood it, and acknowledged its importance in our life, the importance of grace, absolutely. He just didn't respond specifically because I didn't ask him.
Sub